Kent's Garage. Today we're going to talk about RJ, the Factory Freak. That is the name given to this bike by Boosted Cycle Performance Rob, Factory Freak. It's simply because of its horsepower numbers. Now this topic today is brought up over another member's recent dyno run and how unhappy he was with what he actually has. So I wanted to discuss a couple of things about dynos, things that affect the performance. And I'm going to start with, for example, an Olympic runner. So let's take an Olympic runner and let's give him the best diet, let's give him the best training, and you know he's going to run a good number for you. Now, take him off the diet, take him off the training, and ask him to run the same number, it's not going to work. He's not going to be able to perform at the same level. Same thing with your bike. So there's some key things for the dyno that I want to point out. Very simply, let's talk about chain maintenance, service. Let's talk about alignment on the wheel. So if your wheel is not aligned properly and you get a little bit of brake drag, because you got to remember this is your brake rotor and you have a pad on each side. And if your wheel is slightly misaligned, you're creating extra drag on your brakes on the wheel that creates loss of horsepower. Let's also talk about fuel, for example. Factory Freak here did his high numbers with not ordinary fuel. It was 4 gallons of ethanol-free 92 octane fuel mixed with 1.5 gallons of C12 race fuel. Now there's no oxygen sensor on this bike, so I don't have to worry about the lead damaging the oxygen sensor. And that right there gave me a mix of a little bit over 97 octane. That is really good for the compression ratio. Some other things that also boost RJ's numbers is I was running racing oil. I also have new spark plugs in at the time, and they were indexed, which index means that the front of the plug faces the intake charge. So when the intake charge, there's no shrouding of the spark from the ground electrode that is causing slower combustion rate. You may be like, well, how slow would that change? We're talking milliseconds. Like it's hard to fathom, but all these little things add up and make some extra power. Also, air filter. How heavily oiled the air filter is. If you over-oil the air filter, you're actually going to have a little bit less oxygen coming in. Another thing I want to point out, if you look at some of the dyno videos of RJ, there was twin high-velocity fans right in front of RJ, in front of the radiator and the ram air ducts. Now, ram air is essentially homemade turbo, about just shy of 1 psi up at speed at around 120 miles an hour. So you're slightly pressurizing the air box, equaling a little bit more horsepower at speed. So if you're on the dyno and all you've got is some little cheesy box fan in front of there to keep the radiator cool, you're probably losing a few horsepower because you're not throwing it through the ram air duct at 40, 50, 60 miles an hour with a high velocity fan. These are all things to take into consideration. Look at the quality of your dyno operator. Look at the quality of the dyno in the shop overall. If they can't give you a torque value or they seem discombobulated, that they're not knowing what they're doing with your unit, they have some issues, you got to start to wonder, you know, are you really the person to be doing this? But let's talk back on fuel for a minute, just to give you some numbers. For example, BTU. So most fuel today that you buy at the pump has got 10 to 15% ethanol in it. And the BTU for a gallon of gasoline at that point is only about 76,000 BTU, while the same gallon of non-ethanol fuel is around 116,000 BTU. That's a big number difference. I mean, you're talking almost 40,000. So these all affect how much power you're going to make. Lubricated chain, you know, there's another little cheater method. Before you get on the dyno, you could actually pry away the rear brake pads with a butter knife. I've seen guys do it, you know, it makes a little bit of a difference. The ZRX, for example, uses eccentrics on the rear swing arm. And those eccentrics are very easy to get misaligned from the left to the right. If you ever hear a ZRX with a rear brake squeal, that's actually because the rear wheel is not in alignment. The rotor is slightly canted inside the caliper, causing the squeal. So I hope you guys appreciate this, these little tips and tricks and things to help you gain horsepower Also, too, pipe design has a big key in it. RJ is very fortunate. He has one of the last of the Mohicans 4-2-in-1 titanium exhaust system with step tube headers built by Muzzy. You know, you got a Rada out there, Stryker, and a few others that make some really nice headers exactly like that. And actually, the quality of their TIG on the titanium welds are even better than Muzzy. They could have done a better job on this particular pipe with the TIG welding, but that's really nitpicking it. But it is what it is, and I got one of the last ones, and I'm very fortunate and happy about it. So don't get your heart down about a low dyno number. Odds are that, you know, the dyno may not have been serviced recently. When RJ went on the dyno, there was a lot of criticism about it because he produced just over 200 horsepower. There's a few magazine articles where they took a second-gen Busa, what does it take to get over 200 horsepower, and they threw everything they had at it, Montgomery airbox, race oil, exhaust, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and even race fuel. And they only netted, I want to say right around 198 or 192, somewhere around there. They were just a little bit shy. RJ was on a Mustang dyno. The same day on that particular dyno, two other bikes were dynoed, a Turbo Busa and a scratch-built GSXR 1000. I don't know what gen GSXR 1000 is, probably 8 to 10 years old. It made 164 rear wheel horsepower. The Stage 1 turbo bike with a little tweaking that was loosened from boosted cycle performance, if I remember right, made 258 horsepower. And RJ on his first full made 201. After some tweaking, produced 207 from Rob. A month later, went back on the same dyno after calibration of the dyno and still produced just over 200 with 202 to the rear wheel. That's without weather correction factor. Now, a couple of things to note, this was at sea level. This is in Houston, Texas, along the Gulf Coast. Now, we were up around Kingwood area, which is about 75 miles inland from the coast. And two unusual things about both of those days for the time of year. July and August is when both of those dyno pulls were done. We were extremely low humidity. Engines do not like to burn water. So we were in the 60% humidity range in July and in August on the days that we chose to do dyno runs. That is highly unusual for the area where we're at here in Houston. We are normally over 70 into the 80s. Sometimes it feels like 100% humidity. So guys, take this with a grain of salt, you know, and do your research, do your homework, get your bike ready. Put it on a training regimen. When you go in to do a dyno, make sure your oil's fresh. Make sure you got the best fuel you can. Arrive to your tuner with a full tank of fuel. Fresh plugs, you know, chain clean, chain lube, not over tight. Make sure that your alignment's correct. All these little tips and tricks, they add up to extra numbers. They can take the difference from being part sunk to, all right, that was pretty good, I'm happy with that. Also remember, big thing about tuning, always compare it to the quarter mile. See what your mile per hour is. If you're a low mile per hour, chances are you're probably relatively low horsepower or lower than normal. If you've got a really good mile per hour, you know, chances are you're probably making some pretty good power. So remember that, and as always, enjoy. C10 signing off.